The three men who are charged in the death of Ahmaud Arbery is currently underway in Georgia. This after we learned that the prosecutor who was formerly overseeing the case has also been indicted. And so we'll go probably a week or two through jury selection. We've heard about 600 people have received notices to serve on this jury. And we expect that the prosecution and defense are going to pick through these individuals, person by person. I want you guys to take a look at recent coverage on this trial.
Closely watched murder trial for Ahmaud Arbery's accused killers kicked off on Monday in Georgia. Hundreds of people were ordered to report for jury duty in what could be a long, laborious effort to find jurors to hear the trial of three white men charged with fatally shooting the 25-year-old black man in February of 2020. Gregory McMichael, his son Travis, and their neighbor William Bryan are facing state charges including murder, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. The defendants have all pleaded not guilty. The McMichaels say they suspected Arbery was a burglar and acted in self-defense. Arbery was unarmed and out for a jog in the neighborhood when the men chased him in their trucks and fought him before ultimately shooting him. The release of a graphic video of Arbery being killed prompted the state legislature to make significant changes to Georgia criminal law, including passage of the state's first hate crime statute.
I do think that Ahmaud was murdered because he was black. He was jogging through a predominantly white neighborhood, and he was targeted.
Do you believe that you can get a fair and impartial jury in that area when there's been so much publicity in the case? Are you worried about that?
Yes, I have my concerns, being that the jurors will be picked from this community, but I'm hopefully that we'll get the right people in the right place to make the right decision.
Now, Ben, I know that we followed the Chauvin trial closely, and this is a little different because this isn't a case where you had an officer, right? This was three individuals who claimed that they were trying to make a citizen's arrest.
That's right.
Right. But nonetheless, it's a case of injustice.
Right.
Are you concerned about the jury selection, about this trial as well?
Oh, no, absolutely. One thing this country is prolific at is getting away with murder, specifically the murder of black men and women. And then the fact that we are in Georgia, and the fact that these men, one of them, the father in this case, was a former police officer, or is rather a former police officer. And that is how they were able to circumvent justice for as long as they did. And so I do have grave concern over whether or not we will get justice in this case. And more importantly, Georgia, what are we doing to prevent the next vigilante killing of black people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean this case reminds me a lot of Trayvon Martin.
Mm,
These three men taking matters into their own hands, and so I do also think it's going to be an examination of the current laws there,
right.
what laws currently exist that allow people to act with the authority of law enforcement.
Yeah.
I feel like those are outdated, and hopefully whatever grounds for self-defense, because all three men pleaded not guilty. So
Hmm.
whatever grounds of self-defense I think is going to be backed by whatever legislation is enacted in Georgia that would allow these men to
That's right.
act as though they were law enforcement officers,
That's right.
similar to what we saw with in Trayvon Martin. In that situation, you had George Zimmerman who used the stand your ground law. Um, so this is going to be an examination of the law, and hopefully
That's right.
bring to light some overdue changes that
Right.
are needed.
Right. And it's also going to be an examination of the criminal justice process and the jury selection process. And we're going to see how the defense attorneys are going to and this is their right, of course, to get a fair trial as defendants. But what's fair for white men in this country is decidedly different than what's fair for the rest of us. because we're going to see all of the jury reflect and look exactly like the peers of the defendants in this case, who are the men who ultimately killed Ahmaud Arbery.
And I think that as we examine the time we're in, and because Ahmaud Arbery, when we learned that he had been killed,
Yeah,
um, it was quite some time after the incident actually happened.
that's right.
And it, I feel like, was also a part of that week or two where the nation, it was like we learned about Ahmaud Arbery, we learned about Breonna Taylor, and
Yeah.
then we witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And
Mm,
so I feel like there was, this kind of buildup to the global
yeah. Yeah.
response that we saw. And in some way, Ben, I feel like these trials are a continuation of the historic moment that we're in.
Yeah.
And, so many people compare and contrast 2020 to the 50s and the 60s. And so to be able to tell whether or not we've truly made progress, we need to know that something in the criminal justice process has changed
Yeah.
and that this system can work for Ahmaud Arbery's mother, that these
Right.
men can be found guilty and that they can be sentenced fairly.
Mm. And the real question for me, and I think in so many of these cases, is that we have the clear evidence that these men killed Ahmaud Arbery. There's no question about that. We do have to go through um, through the justice process, lest we become vigilantes, much like them. That said, we really have a question on the table. Are we going to allow mm, the unjustified fear of Black people to continue to be an excuse for killing us? You
Mm,
compare this to George Zimmerman, but this is exactly the case. You're absolutely right, because George Zimmerman got away with murder, and the
yeah.
question now is, will these men be able to do the same?
What I will say, what was completely shocking when I learned that the prosecutor was being indicted and that there
That's
had been
right.
some evidence to show that McMichael was a former employee of hers and that she did what she could to avoid him being arrested. And I just thought that that was extremely shocking because historically in this country, when you have seen white people in positions of power who have used that power to cover up misconduct, usually
Mm,
there is no accountability.
that's right.
But in this instant, the fact that she's facing charges, the fact that she's been indicted, I think speaks volumes that we indeed are in a different time.
Mm, mm. And it also shows a parallel to Bob McCullough, the prosecuting attorney in Ferguson, Missouri, who handled the case of Mike Brown. And we saw how he inserted himself on behalf of the defendants. You don't see this happening in any other case except for when it's a Black person who has been killed. We saw the same. I had the same feeling. I can't say that we saw this exact same thing with Trayvon Martin because they took him to trial, but there are some things about the trial itself that made me I didn't really fully believe that the prosecutors were on the side of justice. And that's going to be the real question here. And as you said, Georgia, the prosecutor in this case is under investigation because she inserted herself on behalf of the police officers at the expense of this Black man's life. And that, I believe, is part and parcel of the disease that is at the rot of this empire.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then we learned about Kelsey Rayner,
Mm,
which was another case that she was overseeing. And in that case, one of the individuals who was working at the jail where Kelsey Rayner died was her former employee. And it was
mm,
interesting that there was no indictment in that case. And so now we're beginning to see a pattern of misuse of power with this specific attorney there. But, Ben, the other thing that I think about, is there in Georgia, there's another case. Kendrick Johnson, who was
Yeah.
found in Valdosta. He was a high school student, was found rolled up in a mat.
Yeah.
And there's now a movie called Finding Kendrick Johnson that's on Amazon Prime. I had a chance to watch it yesterday, and the images are just burned into my mind. But what you cannot ignore in that case is the cover up,
Mm,
and at what point is America going to reckon with this long standing history
mm,
of covering up injustices and violence against specifically Black men?
yeah.
There's been this long standing history. I mean, even they drew the parallel in this documentary to Emmett Till
Mm,
and how he was accused by a white woman of, he whistled at her, but we found out 70 years later that she recanted her accusations and said that they were lies.
mm,
And so
mm,
our country has this long standing history, so many examples
yeah.
of cases
Yeah.
that just appear to be covered up.
Yeah. That's because this country has a vested interest in the continuation, right? It's been a long-standing vilification of Black people, Black men specifically, most certainly Black women too. They, they, this country has a vested interest in maintaining that fear of Blackness, and the fear of other. Right? We see very similar parallels with other marginalized communities that are always lifted up to be the boogeyman. But in our case, it ends with our death, because that is the justification that gives that police officer in Ohio the ability to pull up on the scene of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, and without even ascertaining anything, within 2.7 seconds, executed a 12-year-old Black boy. And that's because this country is used to viewing us as as monsters, and they're maintaining that image.